and numerous academic journal articles on human rights, including right to self-determination. Thank you very much, Mr. Freeman.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organisers of this conference for having invited me. It's an honour to be here and a pleasure. And I'd like to apologise to you all for having arrived late. I'm afraid my personal self-determination was limited by the railway timetable. I've come here from Suffolk, and it's quite a challenge to get here early from Suffolk. Okay, so these are some thoughts about rethinking self-determination. The idea of rethinking self-determination implies the following thoughts. Firstly, once we were thinking about self-determination. Secondly, there was something inadequate about the way we were thinking about self-determination. And thirdly, we should seek a more adequate way of thinking about self-determination. In order to rethink self-determination more adequately, I suggest, we need to be clear about how we have thought about self-determination in the past, why we now think this past thinking was inadequate, and what we want to achieve by rethinking self-determination. Wow. What is the problem, or what are the problems that rethinking self-determination is intended to help to solve? In answering this question, I shall propose 4 theses. 1, self-determination is a fundamental and necessary feature of the human condition. Secondly, it is a human right. Thirdly, it is in part illusory. And fourthly, it is potentially dangerous. The most familiar and the primary legal definition of self-determination, as you know, is that of the Common Article 1 of the 1966 United Nations Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. It reads as follows: all peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. This article was inserted in these 2 human rights covenants on the insistence of the newly independent post-colonial members of the UN. It was initially resisted by the Western imperialist governments, who accepted it only when the worldwide process of decolonization was almost complete, and this provision was consequently largely redundant. The historian Eric Weitz has criticized the international legal definition for being both historically and conceptually too narrow, in that it is limited to the right to national self-determination in the context of anti-colonial liberation. He locates the origin of the idea of self-determination in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, where it is a strictly individualist idea. Every human individual, according to Kant, determines themselves through their interaction with their environment. In doing so, they act autonomously. That is, they make choices, including moral choices, with the aid of their reason. They have a strict duty to make these choices in accordance with the moral law. It is moral self-determination, Kant argued, that makes us truly human. It gives us our dignity. As moral agents, we have the duty to respect the dignity and autonomy, that is, the right to self-determination of all other individuals. Weitz argues that this individualist conception of self-determination began to change in the work of the philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Fichte was initially a follower of the liberal individualist philosophy of Kant, but under the influence of Napoleon's conquest of Germany, he emphasized the importance of the rights of nations. Although Fichte's intense German nationalism is often seen as a forerunner of Nazism, Fichte sought to reconcile individual rights with the rights of nations. He argued that individual rights could be protected only in a self-determining nation. Here we already see the seeds of the UN conception of the right to national self-determination as closely associated with individual human rights. In the 19th century, individual self-determination was transformed into three main forms of collective self-determination. The first was that of liberal nationalism, represented, for example, by John Stuart Mill. Liberals held that individual rights could be protected only in a national community. Individuals, it was said, could be free only in community with others with whom they shared a common culture. Individual self-determination and collective national self-determination were therefore inseparable. This was a universal truth, so that the right to individual freedom and the right to national self-determination were universal human rights. The second turn to collective self-determination was that of authoritarian nationalism, the extreme form of which was fascism. The third was socialism, especially Marxism. Although self-determination in Marxism took the form of the emancipatory self-determination of the working class, Marx and Engels supported several national liberation struggles, such as that of the Irish against the English, the Poles against the Russians, and the Italians against the Habsburg Empire. In 1896, the Socialist International included in its program an article on self-determination for all peoples. Meanwhile, movements for national liberation from Western imperial rule were stirring around the world. In the early 20th century, Lenin advocated a form of Marxist national self-determination, while President Woodrow Wilson of the USA countered with a liberal democratic form of national self-determination based on the historical experience of his country. Wilson's Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, was skeptical. Quote, "The right to self-determination," he wrote, "is bound to be the basis of impossible demands and create trouble in many lands. The phrase is simply loaded with dynamite. It will raise hopes which can never be realized. It will, I fear, cost thousands of lives. What a calamity that the phrase was ever uttered. What misery it will cause." End quote. Some 70 years later, the dynamite exploded as Czechoslovakia split into two and Yugoslavia collapsed into civil war. However, the verbal convergence between the Marxist-Leninist and the liberal democratic Wilsonian conceptions of self-determination enabled the United Nations to include the principle, not the right, of self-determination of peoples in Article 1 of the UN Charter. However, when the UN adopted its Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, it did not include the right to self-determination. The Western imperialist powers did not want to encourage anti-colonial movements, and the USA did not want to encourage human rights and self-determination claims by African Americans. The worldwide anti-colonial movement after the Second World War eventually succeeded in including the right of peoples to self-determination in the two UN Human Rights Covenants of 1966. Individual human rights and the right of peoples to self-determination appear to have been reconciled in international law. However, the enacted text concealed at least three unsolved problems. Robert Lansing's dynamite lying unattended in the cellar of international law. The first problem was that the covenants did not define peoples, the entities that had been awarded the right to self-determination, and there was no definition elsewhere in international law. The Nigerians had the right to self-determination, but did the Catalans? The Palestinians had the right, but did the Tibetans or the Kurds? The second problem was that the UN had accorded an important right to peoples, but had also affirmed the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. It seemed to assume that peoples were either the citizens of established states or the peoples of colonies who had the right to establish an independent state. It failed to address the problems raised by diverse peoples in multinational states. The third problem was that the declarations assumed compatibility between individual human rights and the right of peoples to self-determination. This assumption was implausible. These unsolved problems meant that the right to self-determination was potentially dangerous. Weitz's narrative of the journey made by the idea of self-determination from individualism to collectivism is illuminating, but it suffers from a defect for which he criticizes international law. It is historically and conceptually too narrow. It is limited to the modern era of liberalism and nationalism. Human infants cannot survive without the help of human adults. Human adults cannot achieve much without the help of other adults. To have access to reliable help from other adults, humans must live in communities of rights, obligations, and mutual trust. Such communities are as ancient as history. They provide cooperation for the common welfare, roughly what we now call development, conflict resolution and the maintenance of internal order, and defense against external enemies. Collective self-determination is therefore ancient. It was not, contrary to what Weitz suggested, an invention of the 19th century. In ancient times, expanding empires frequently met resistance from would-be self-determining peoples. It is less certain whether the idea of individual rights is ancient or modern. In Sophocles' play Antigone, for example, the protagonist defies the orders of her king and buries her rebellious brother. We might think she is claiming an individual right to freedom of religion, but she appeals to the higher law of her community. Weitz's story of the transformation of the idea of self-determination from individualism to collectivism also underestimates the place of collective self-determination in the two great 18th century declarations of rights, the American Declaration of Independence of 1776 and the French Revolutionary Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen of 1789. The American Declaration begins with a reference to the necessity of, quote, one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, end quote, and goes on to declare, famously, quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, end quote. Article 2 of the French Declaration proclaims that, quote, the final end of every political institution is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man, end quote. While Article 3 says that, quote, the basis of all sovereignty lies essentially in the nation, end quote. The political theorist Emma McKinnon has emphasized that the presence of the right to national self-determination in these classic 18th century declarations, often revered as pioneers of the idea of individual human rights. In this context, it is worth noting another important declaration of rights. On the 2nd of September 1945, Ho Chi Minh, leader of the League for the Independence of Vietnam, commonly known as the Viet Minh, proclaimed the independent Democratic Republic of Vietnam in Hanoi. His speech began with the following words, quote, all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. The Declaration of the French Revolution on the Rights of Man and the Citizen also states, all men are born free and with equal rights and must always remain free and have equal rights. Both international law and Weitz's narrative of the history of the idea of self-determination raise questions about the relations between individual rights and the rights of nations. They do not address the rights of vulnerable groups such as women, children, disabled persons, ethnic and racial minorities, indigenous peoples, refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless persons, the poor and left behind communities. Orthodox human rights theory maintains that the complete fulfillment of individual human rights would be sufficient to protect the rights of members of these groups. Others argue that experience shows that in the absence of collective rights, the individual rights of members of vulnerable groups will in practice be insecure. Liberal democracies privilege the preferences and interests of majorities, provided that the human rights of minorities are protected. However, majoritarian democracy may not protect the legitimate interests of what are sometimes called permanent minorities. That is, those groups that are never likely to form a majority. This problem has led some to call for minority rights of various kinds, including forms of self-determination, to protect minorities against what has been called majority tyranny. The Canadian philosopher Will Kimlicka has argued that human rights may be insufficient to protect the fundamental interests of vulnerable minorities. He invites us to suppose members of the white Anglophone majority in Canada exercising their human right to freedom of movement, settling in the traditional homeland of a native group, and then exercising their human right to participate in local government to override the economic and cultural interests of local indigenous populations. Kimlicka argues that this injustice might be carried out without any human rights violations. If the white Anglophones become a majority, they could carry out policies against the interests of the indigenous minority without violating their human rights. There are therefore problems with the subjects of self-determination. Who has this right? Individuals, nations, peoples, minorities, communities, other groups. There are also problems with the objects of the right. To what do the holders of the right to self-determination have a right? International lawyers distinguish external from internal self-determination. A people, or more precisely a state, exercises external self-determination when it acts independently of external powers, whether they be other states or transnational economic actors. The drafters of the Right of Peoples to Self-Determination in the two 1966 UN covenants probably had in mind such external self-determination. Internal self-determination is democracy. This is the meaning of self-determination we have in mind when we think of self-governing communities, whether these communities be local, national, or indeed supranational, such as the European Union. The international community has in practice been ambivalent about both forms of self-determination. It has been reluctant to allow self-determination to minority nationalities and does not require its member states to be democracies. If the right of peoples to self-determination is interpreted as the right to democracy, it encounters some problems of democracy. Although the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does not explicitly recognize a right to democracy, it does state in Article 21 that the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. In these populist times, we hear quite a lot about the will of the people, supposed to be threatened by various elite conspiracies. The political philosopher Albert Wheel has shown that the will of the people is what he calls a modern myth. That's the title of a recent book of his. In real democracies, the will of the people is rendered problematic by intense minorities who have more at stake in certain public policies than indifferent majorities, by shifting majorities, and by the absence of majorities on certain issues. The will of the people has been much invoked in connection with the UK referendum on remaining in or leaving the European Union. Usually the will of the people refers to the supposed wills, plural, of the 52% of those who voted in the referendum and who voted to leave the EU. But what is the will of the people now? There are several Brexit options, and none is supported by 50% of the people. In fact, in one recent poll, of all the Brexit options, the most popular was supported by just 28% of the people. Self-determination in the form of democracy also raises questions about the rights of those excluded from the demos. Democracy is ruled by the demos. Refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless persons may have no right to participate in democratic politics. Thus, the democratic self-determination of peoples fails to provide for the self-determination of such people. The Common Article 1 of the two 1966 UN Human Rights Covenants says that by virtue of the right of self-determination, all peoples freely determine their political status. The original meaning of political self-determination was independence from colonial rule, and the international community has generally been unwilling to concede a right of secession beyond the context of European colonialism. The international legal principles of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states trumps the right of peoples to self-determination. This is a reminder that the international community is a legal order of states, not peoples. There are, however, a number of plausible objections to interpreting the right of peoples to self-determination as a right to secession. Firstly, secession is often accompanied by violence. Secondly, secession often leaves one or more vulnerable minorities in the seceding state. Since secession is often motivated by strong nationalist sentiments, the seceding majority will often fail to respect minority and human rights. Thirdly, the majority in the original state usually opposes secession, so that secession by a minority violates the right to self-determination of the majority. Fourthly, secession may create problems of distributive justice if the secessionists are the richest part of the population and control the richest part of the territory. Opposing arguments appeal to the right to self-determination as a democratic right. Problems of secession often arise not from the secessionists exercising their right of self-determination, but from the state and the international community failing to observe the people's right of self-determination. Some scholars propose that there is no general right of secession, but there may be a right of secession in particular circumstances when justice or pragmatic politics demand that such a right be recognized. International lawyers and political philosophers generally favor limited autonomy, roughly what we in the United Kingdom call devolution, to secession. This may be, in certain circumstances, the best available solution to the problem of tensions between the state and the majority on one hand and minorities on the other hand. However, it raises, in a less extreme form, similar problems to those raised by secession: peace and good relations, legitimate rights of majorities, and justice within the autonomous entity. Another alternative to secession is that of consociational democracy. This form of democracy, groups, usually national or ethnic, share power. Northern Ireland is a consociational democracy. Objections to consociational democracy are: one, that it violates the democratic principle of one citizen, one vote, because it's groups that have votes rather than individuals. Secondly, that it imposes on citizens identities that they may not be willing to accept. In Northern Ireland, you have to be a unionist or a nationalist. If you're not either, then you're kind of left out, although you still have a vote. Thirdly, that it makes problematic identities permanent or semi-permanent. Consociational democracy is, however, favoured when it is the only practicable alternative to violent conflict. The right to self-determination may also be problematic because it overstates the extent of freedom that individuals, communities, or peoples have in the real world. The UN covenants say that by virtue of the right to self-determination, peoples freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. But they don't. The people may, in exercising their right to self-determination, adopt a policy that turns out to be impossible or unexpectedly costly to implement. In 2015, the Greek people voted by 61% to 39% to reject an international bailout package of their economy. However, faced by possible retaliation by the European Union, the Greek government accepted the bailout and imposed additional austerity measures on the Greek people. The Greek people could not freely pursue their economic development because economic realities constrained their options. There is a similar problem with cultural self-determination. In the age of the internet, efforts to protect national cultures may be defeated by the power and or the appeal of global, often American culture. Nature itself places constraints on self-determination. As climate change threatens the security of the planet and its inhabitants, requiring self-determination at the global level. Historically, national self-determination has been the principal rival to individual self-determination. However, other forms of self-determination have also been important. Various collectivities or communities that lie between the nation-state and the individual have made claims to self-determination. For example, national minorities, ethnic minorities, indigenous peoples, local governments, workers' organizations, and women's groups. It is obvious that some self-determination claims can conflict with other self-determination claims. Local forms of self-determination raise issues of capacity and the interests of others and of society as a whole. All self-determiners need resources from their environment, often from the state, and all have impacts on and therefore obligations to others. These fundamental realities of self-determination place practical and moral limits on self-determination. The European Union and the European Court of Human Rights have a principle that is intended to provide solutions to the problems that arise when different entities claim the right to self-determination in forms that are not mutually compatible. This is the principle of subsidiarity. This principle says that power and authority should be located at the lowest level that is compatible with the values of those affected and a reasonable level of efficiency. This principle seeks to allocate self-determination to appropriate levels of decision-making. The principle of subsidiarity is promising in theory, but has turned out disappointing in practice. The very fact that there is a perceived need to rethink self-determination expresses a dissatisfaction with the distribution of powers even within liberal democracies, and of course within the European Union. Why then do we need to rethink self-determination? Historically, self-determination was claimed by various communities and by individuals and nations. There is widespread discontent around the world about the current distribution of decision-making power. Much of this focuses on globalization and on such remote organizations as the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the European Union, etc. Enhancing self-determination may seem to be a plausible solution, but this begs the question as to the level at which self-determination should be implemented: individuals, communities, nation-states, or beyond the nation-state. It is fairly obvious that different problems require solutions at different levels. The traditional values of individual and national self-determination are far from obsolete, but they are not enough. We face the daunting challenge of finding solutions that are big enough for the problems, but small enough to remain human. Self-determination is a necessary feature of the human condition. It is a human right in that it is grounded in the value of individual and collective freedom. It is, however, in part illusory because we both must and should exercise freedom under the constraints of others and of nature. It is potentially dangerous because freedom can be exercised to harm others. Self-determination is an intrinsic good in that it is good that individuals and communities retain some control over their lives. But self-determination is only good if the self is good and its determinations are good. The value of self-determination, therefore, must be located in the wider context of the values of democracy, human rights, and justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, I don't think that I need to summarize this session because it was a very good speech, and I have my notes and I have my own question, but I would like to first ask the audience whether they have any questions. Yes.
James just a question. I mean, you raised the idea of self-determination has been seen as good in context. All right. And it just reminded me of something that you see before human rights body, that sometimes self-determination is invoked by states saying, well, actually, you say we have certain human rights and we have certain standards in human rights, but actually we also have right to self-determination, which means we don't have to follow your standards. And then, in fact, self-determination is often invoked as an exception to international human rights standards.
Can I answer them
Yes.
one by one? Yes, okay. Well, thank you for the questions. A very good one. I think there's always, well, since the UN was set up in 1945, there's always been a tension between the right to self-determination and the other human rights, which I think is yes, sorry, I'm sorry. Thanks. Which is shown by the fact that the right to self-determination was not included in the Universal Declaration. There is a lot of politics behind that, as well as law and philosophy, because the imperial powers, who were very strong then, weren't very keen on the right to self-determination for their colonies. They're very keen on it for themselves. Since the time of the two covenants in 1966, and the fact that the majority, certainly in the General Assembly of the United Nations, has been made up of former colonies or their friends, at least, then the claim that you've made is quite often heard, that self-determination somehow trumps human rights. Now, there is a very difficult philosophical issue, which I did allude to, and that is that some people believe, and this goes back at least to the early 19th century, that human rights can only be protected in an appropriate political and institutional and legal context. And the best context is that of the nation state. However, even if it is true that the nation state is necessary to protect human rights, it's obviously not sufficient. Because many nation states do a pretty bad job of protecting human rights. So I think when that argument is made, I don't want to be too dogmatic about that. You have to look at each case on its merits, because all governments violate human rights sometimes when they're under pressure. We had a lot of issues in this country after 9/11, in the United States after 9/11, about suspending rights of suspected terrorists, an issue that's not entirely gone away. So when democratic governments are under pressure, human rights come under pressure. So a lot of governments are under pressure. They have massive problems of economic development, of law and order and so on in their countries. Nevertheless, appeals to the right to self-determination or sovereignty can simply be a cover for the interests of corrupt elites, to put it bluntly, and one ought to put it bluntly sometimes, I think. So you have to look at each case, and insisting that fairly strongly, as UN committees and so on tend to do, that they should respect human rights. But being sympathetic to the real problems that governments face seems to me the right way to go. But I do think that claim is sometimes at least partly bogus. It covers up corruption and human rights violations that are not justified by by the needs of economic development and the other priorities of governments.
Questions? I actually myself had one question. You mentioned about consent, and it is actually grounded from the ancient agreements in America and France. And I just wanted to ask you, what today, when we think about democracy, we may think that democratic societies are more stabilized, and then the consent can be also grounded and can be applied in a more better way than a post-conflict state, for instance. I just want to ask you, what do you think can be the risks of asking consent? This could be a referendum. Are there any other risks that we may need to consider in democratic societies and maybe post-conflict societies?
Right.
Maybe any past examples that you can come up with.
Yes. Okay, it's a very good question. I'm not sure about.
Sorry, I don't.
No.
If you want, we can ask other questions.
No. I should do my best to answer a very good question. Obviously, two things I'd say. Well, to start with, in answer. One is that countries around the world governments vary a lot in how stable they are. So obviously, a government that comes in after conflict is going to have a lot of problems of restoring order. Just think of what a government of Syria might have to do in the next decade, for example. There are going to be massive economic problems, social problems, healing wounds, and all of that. That's the first point. And the second point is, if you look historically, this is a rather pessimistic point, the Western liberal democracies that are relatively stable, have relatively good human rights records, weren't always like that. They have histories of conflict and human rights violations and so on. Remember, I was thinking about this subject when I had the benefit of seeing Shakespeare's two plays, Henry IV Part 1 and Henry IV Part 2, which I strongly recommend. And what struck me about those two plays is Shakespeare's, with brilliant dramatic success, it's all about warlords and human rights violations and conflict and the terrible mess that England was in at that time. And it did strike me that England at that period was quite like some countries are today. And establishing the rule of law, human rights and so on was a long and painful process which is far from perfectly completed now. That doesn't mean that anything goes, it just means that solving the massive problems that many countries have while respecting human rights is a big challenge. But there are quite good reasons for thinking that the thing about human rights is this is one of the key arguments for them. And that is the counter-argument, which is a little bit implied in your question and the previous question, is, sorry, we have such big problems that we can't afford human rights. The answer to that is, you can't be sure what problems you have if people aren't free to express what they feel about their society and its problems. You don't know what the needs of the people are if the people aren't allowed to speak. And we know that when there are authoritarian governments are nearly always corrupt. You can get some corruption in democracy, but generally the more authoritarian a government is, the more likely it is to be corrupt. So its claim to be promoting the needs of the people is unlikely to be genuine. So there's a strong case for defending human rights and democracy, even in difficult circumstances. But it can be very difficult. And there's no country in the world that has a clean record in this historically.
Could you say a few words about the relationship between self-determination and consent? And my specific example would be Northern Ireland. Could address the relationship between self-determination and consent. And my specific case would be Northern Ireland,
Yes.
which under the Good Friday Belfast Agreement will remain part of the United Kingdom as long as that is what a majority of the people in Northern Ireland want. Which posits a situation of where that if 50% plus one voted to become part of United Ireland, the United Kingdom would give effect to that. And I'm saying it in the context of your earlier point about consociationalism, is that it is an internal governance structure based on consociationalism, power sharing, but it has a constitutional question that's based on a majority. And in a divided society where the minority will always be, for the next 30 or 40 years, greater than 40%, is there not a clash between the two?
Yes. Right, thank you. That's an excellent question, and again, a very difficult one. One of the problems with the idea of consent, as you raise it, is that we're rather stuck on majoritarian democracy, as you put it. If 50% plus one vote for something, then that's okay. And that raises the problem, as I did briefly mention, of intense minorities. Sometimes minorities care much more about the issue than the majority. And one political theorist, Robert Dahl, tried to build that into his idea of democracy. Somehow you should be able to register not just your vote, but how strongly you feel about your vote. No one's ever taken that up, except that one of the kind of slightly hidden issues in our recent referendum on the EU is that some countries have constitutional provisions that you need a so-called supermajority to change the constitution. Some countries have that, some don't. And the UK did have that once. My memory serves me correctly, some time ago there was a referendum as to whether Scotland should get devolution. There was a provision, which is quite commonly made in some constitutions, that the result would not count unless a certain percentage of people voted, so you have to have a reasonable turnout. You can't change the constitution if only 10% of the people bothered to vote. And also there had to be more than 50% in favour, but usually it's something like 2/3. In the United States, it's a very complicated system for changing its constitution. You can't change the constitution just by 50% plus one. It's rather complicated. But I'm not sure that would work with Northern Ireland. I think
50% plus one.
Yes, I know. I know that's the rule. I'm just saying, if they had thought, oh no, let's have a supermajority, whether that would have been a better idea. It might possibly be, because in the EU referendum, 60-something, for an exact number, percent of Northern Ireland voted to stay in the European Union. That is to say, a smallish number of unionists voted to stay in the EU. So if there'd only been a vote in Northern Ireland on the EU, it would just about have got a 2/3 majority. It was close. However, that wasn't the rule on that referendum. Northern Ireland is a very good example, but there are other examples where there might be a majority for changing the constitutional setup, even the borders of the country, like United Ireland, but where there is a very intense minority. That's theoretically, I take it is the problem. And I think it's in the nature of the case that there's not an easy solution. If you're already stuck with the idea of 50% plus one, the best then is to have very strong guarantees for the minority. But sometimes minorities will not be satisfied with that, and then you're in trouble. I sometimes say to my students, political theory doesn't make difficult problems easy. It just clarifies the nature of the difficult problem. The real world has difficult problems, and that's the one. As I say, the strongest solution, and Northern Ireland, which is a strong and clear case of this, is not the only one, is, I'll give you another example, which was not as difficult a case, perhaps, as Northern Ireland. In the I think it was 1992, there was a referendum in Quebec for leaving Canada, which was narrowly lost, and the majority in Quebec are French-speaking. There's a quite a large English-speaking minority, but there are also indigenous groups in Quebec. And one of them actually petitioned the United Nations to stay in Canada if the vote had been for leaving. Now, it's different from Northern Ireland because this is a very small group. And therefore, the amount of trouble they could have caused if Quebec had become independent would be much less than potential trouble in Northern Ireland. Nevertheless, the principle is the same. When one group wants to leave and there's what's called an internal minority, sometimes called a double minority, that feels very strongly that it doesn't want to change, then you have a very difficult situation. And you had that situation when Yugoslavia fell apart. This is what Robert Lansing is one of my favourite neglected figures in history, because he saw this problem, which Woodrow Wilson didn't. Woodrow Wilson didn't know much about Europe. And Lansing knew better that if you try to create a nation in a country that became Yugoslavia, there are a lot of potential problems there. And when the communist system broke up and Yugoslavia broke up, we had a terrible civil wars. And that's because some of the minority groups were not happy, and indeed the majorities. So sometimes you do have potential troubles, and you need to think about those in advance. So I don't, maybe this 50% plus one should have been thought through more. I don't know enough about the detail. I mean, I'm not an expert on the Belfast Agreement, and I don't know how far they're using it to deal with this problem.
I think one other factor affecting the self-determination, because it's not the people who asking for a vote. It is a executive state by political decision to determine whether they have such consent.
Yes, but when there's a minority, well, in the case of Unionists in Northern Ireland, at the moment they're a majority, but they might become a minority in the future.
Ironically, the state of Northern Ireland, or statehood, was created specifically designed to ensure Protestant Unionist majority in perpetuity.
Yes.
And it will turn out that on the 100th anniversary of the creation of the state, the permanent minority will become permanent majority will become a minority.
Yes.
So
yes.
the 2021 census,
Yes.
Catholics would be in a majority.
The best you can do if you're committed to a majority self-determination, which is what the British UK government has done in Northern Ireland, is to have strong and highly credible guarantees for the rights of minorities, and possibly internationally guaranteed. They won't always work. There are some situations which are just very difficult, and that would be one. But of course, the alternative is to say that if the nationalists became a majority, that they don't have the right to self-determination if they want a united Ireland. This is the problem with self-determination. Self-determination claims can conflict. And the most famous, notorious example around the world is the Israel-Palestine question. And it can be extraordinarily difficult to, a lot of wise, clever people spend a lot of time trying to solve these problems. Just a little anecdote. This doesn't, I've given you the best answer I can to your the question that doesn't have an easy answer. The reason I won't bore you with, a couple of months ago, I had a dinner with a former Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom. He happens to be married to one of my wife's oldest friends. That's not a political reason I know him, it's a purely personal reason. And over dinner he said to me, how did they solve the problem of Northern Ireland? We ought to learn from that for the Israel-Palestine question. So I gave it some thought, and I said to him, I'm very sorry, but I think actually, superficially there may be similarities, but the differences are enormous. And the things that enabled the Belfast Agreement to be made, it's very hard to find similar factors in the Israel-Palestine. I could go into them. So that is actually a more difficult problem. If the nationalists became one politically interesting part of that scenario is what the reaction of the government of the Republic would be. Because the government of the Republic would not want a very unstable situation in Northern Ireland, is my judgment. So there'll be a very complicated political situation there.
Thank you very much. We actually need to move to the second panel, panel 2. There will be plenty of time to discuss with Mikhail Freeman during the lunch break.
So there was just one question there, is it? All
right, if you would like to have... Okay, Kenza, go for it.
Yeah. Sorry, it's just a quick question. You mentioned the works of Kim Mikhail earlier, and I just wanted, and you talked about imposed identities. I just wanted to know whether you could expand on sort of the essentialist critique when we talk about group rights for self-determination, sort of imposing the identity in a certain group and defining it in its confine without looking at more sort of individualistic approaches of self-determination.
Well, there are a number of consociational schemes around the world. There's Northern Ireland, there's Bosnia, Cyprus, and because it gives constitutional political rights to groups defined usually in ethnic terms, sometimes by religion, sometimes by language, sometimes these are mixed up together. You use the word essentialist. It's kind of essentialist, and it assumes that people just have these identities, they don't change, that people are not politically allowed to have mixed identities. I mean, I have friends from Northern Ireland who support the Alliance Party who are very uncomfortable and who think, you know, that democracy is a system where individuals have democratic rights. And they can choose to vote for this party or that party, but they shouldn't have to be confined by their identity. But there are difficult situations. Another case is not strictly consociational, but in New Zealand, Maoris have a certain number of seats in the New Zealand Parliament. And you can see historically why that was done. But again, there are many people who have mixed parentage, for example, who are half Maori or quarter Maori or something like that. And there's not just that people may choose an identity that the politicians don't want them to have, but they may actually have it in a sense because of their parents may be. I'll just give you one example, if I may finish with this. I had a colleague from Bosnia, who's a professor of international law, who left just when the war there started because he had a job with the UN, actually, and he had a UN passport. I didn't even know they existed, but they do apparently. And when I first met him, I had lunch with him, and we were talking about identities, just the kind of issue you raised. And he said, Michael, I want you to tell me what my identity is. Until recently, I would have told you my identity was I was a citizen of Yugoslavia, but that country no longer exists. My father is a Serb. My mother is a Muslim. His mother, no, one of his relatives was Jewish. So what am I? And he wanted to choose the identity of a citizen of Bosnia, but given the actual situation, that was an identity which was not easily on offer. So identity is can be for many people very complicated. So when politicians impose them, sometimes there are good reasons. This is the only way of achieving peace in the short run, but sometimes there are long-run problems about that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. I also personally have the same question on my mind on personal identity. My family is also, my father's side are from Macedonia, but Albanian village, and my mom's side are from Greece, but we happened to be in Turkey, and I was born and raised in Turkey. Now married to a magnificent guy who is from Tenerife. They're also indigenous, local, and now living in the UK. So it is, I could totally understand it, and I think this is a very good way to finish. Identity question mark. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mikhail.